Welcome to the Voices of Australia podcast, hosted by me, Anthea Hancox, and Lydia Tessima, where the concept and reality of social cohesion is deeply explored. This podcast is brought to you by the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute.
Each fortnight we bring to you an interesting guest who present a new and often unexplained perspective of Australia. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we are recording the podcast, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and in the spirit of reconciliation, we pay our respect to all First Nations people.
Hello everyone, and it's delightful to have you here today. We have two wonderful guests to share this conversation with us. The first is Viv Nguyen. Viv is a passionate advocate for diversity and multiculturalism, but most people will of course know her as the chairperson of the Victorian Multicultural Commission. She is, though, also a business executive and a community leader. She's got more than 25 years' experience in the corporate, public and community sectors. And in her previous role as president of the Vietnamese community in Australia, the Victorian chapter, Viv played a key role in advocating for Australia's first Vietnamese cultural museum, along with many other things. And together with her, we have Hanad Hersi. Hanad is a youth advocate who works tirelessly to ensure that young people from diverse backgrounds have access to opportunities and are given the resources they need to prosper and lead fulfilled lives. Hanad became interested in social services because of his love of travelling. For the past 5 years, Hanad has been a grassroots community advocate, particularly in the development of the youth engagement space. He was a member of the Victorian Multicultural Commission's Regional Advisory Council and collaborated with various community organisations, but he is also the programs coordinator at Youth Activating Youth, where he works with vulnerable young people who are at risk of disengaging from the education system and are at risk of coming into contact with the criminal justice system. So I'm absolutely delighted to have you both here, and we're really pleased to be discussing with you both what strengthens social cohesion and what are the sorts of things that social cohesion might mean to each of you. So I'd be really interested in your interpretations of this term. How do you think of social cohesion, either personally or within your roles? Viv?
Thank you, Andy and Lydia, for having me join you with this important conversation. And hello, Hanad. For me, social cohesion means a number of things, but importantly, it is about participation in this democratic society, particularly so for people from refugee backgrounds or migrants who come to Australia from a country that isn't democratic or a single regime, or where democracy is relatively young. The ability and the opportunity to participate in this system is really important, because that then allows us knowledge, communication, connection, and then be able to understand different perspectives and respect the law and be able to live and work and play together. And for me, participation in this society has always been something that really drives me from a very young age. From when I came to Australia as a refugee back in 1983, that was a long time ago, gee. And I always found that, knowing and wanting to find out why people are doing that, why I've got this but I can't get there, or how is it that that person doesn't look very capable to me, but he or she or they've got this gig and I couldn't get this gig. You ask those things and you understand a bit more about the challenges, the barriers, but also the opportunities. And that's what I think is really important, that everybody has the opportunity to participate. And to be able to participate, we need to know what the barriers and also the opportunities are. And if they are barriers, we should try to, or we need to try and break them down. If there are opportunities, make sure that those opportunities are available to everyone.
Viv, you arrived as a 12-year-old. What was your initial view of this new country that you'd come to? How did you perceive it?
Yeah. It was certainly very strange, because when I came in 83, we went to the Midway Hostel in Maribyrnong at the time, and we got beef and potato gravy, and we had to use a fork and a knife, and all of which was extremely unfamiliar to me. But we learned to adapt, because from my perspective, I knew this is going to be my new home. And because I was a refugee, at that time, the thought of returning to Vietnam was just out of the question. So this is my new home. What do I need to do to be part of this society? So you learn about yourself, you learn about the environment, you learn about the issues and the challenges and the barriers and the whys and the hows and yeah, you just really have to embrace, because you didn't really have another option.
And did you find getting into the school system a challenge as well? That was there any connectivity between what you'd been learning before you arrived here and what the expectations were when you actually started school?
They were two totally different worlds.
I was going to say, you would have had to have learned English. Is that right?
Oh, yes, that's right. And then in Vietnam, I started year 7. We started school in Vietnam in around about July, and I left in December. So every morning we would, stand there and we sing the national anthem and we do some physical exercise. Well, none of that was here in Australia. And when I started high school here in Melbourne, in Brunswick, we went to Brunswick High School, which had a very strong Greek population. And we were whistled into a bunch of portables where we had to learn English, and we would have 4 English subjects and the other 3 subjects. That makes total 7 for us. And for the large part of your everyday schooling is hanging around other people like us, and so I found that challenging, but not so unfamiliar, because we'd be playing skipping rope and we'd be doing these things with other kids, so it wasn't too bad. And the boys got to learn football and soccer, and they would share the playground and things of that nature. But for me, the bit that was really critical for me was the teachers. My English as a second language teachers were just totally amazing. Like, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't have known about these things. They taught us, they helped us to fill out forms. They even sponsored my parents as the guarantor because I was the youngest out of the 6 kids. They actually became my guarantor in order for us to apply for my parents to reunite with us.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was going to say, apart from those challenges, you kind of touched on what made you feel safe, but what was that? Do you have a memory of the first thing that really made you feel safe in this country, or made you feel like you had that strong sense of belonging?
I wouldn't say that I felt safe in the first couple of years in Australia, though, because, we got people telling us, there's too many Asian people and, this, that and others. And you went to school and you brought food, and that your food smelled and all of these things back in those days. But regardless of those, I kind of learned to accept that in some way, shape or form, and remind myself that I need to do something to get better at, so that I can overcome that or beat them.
Or beat them. I like that.
I'm not sure I've beaten them, whoever that they are, but I certainly overcome it in myself to know that I do have some strength, and with my education and so on and so forth, that I can actually get create my own path with the supports and so on. But I felt that I could look at that more as a strength, not all the time, but after a while, you learn to take those as a strength more so than as a barrier or a demoralizing factor.
Absolutely.
Now that I think takes time. I can't say that I had that right in me at the very moment, but you get that over time, and you build your allies, and you've got some friends, and I was lucky to have found some really important and good people in my life that have helped me build that strength and that resilience and that character in me.
It's so interesting how a shift of perspective can help you actually deal with the same situation completely differently. And I relate to that. I injured my back in 2018. I had a spinal injury at the age of 21 years old. And for a while, I was home ridden for a few months, but for a while I was really discouraged, and I just felt really upset as a young woman that I was having to deal with this, and I felt as though I had a few things to blame for it. Over time, I realized that I had to learn to accept the injury and start understanding how I could use the new knowledge or the treatment I was getting to my benefit to ensure my strength moving forward. So I really relate to that. Yeah.
And you have some friends and some allies and some people along the way to kind of help nudge you along as well.
Yeah.
And for me, that's my culture, my faith, my family, and a whole bunch of people you kind of randomly meet over time, and you kind of keep those connections.
Hanad, I'm imagining that this conversation resonates for you too. And can you tell us a little bit about what safety means for you personally, but also for the young people that you work with, and how you think that sense of safety actually resonates when you think about social cohesion.
Yeah, definitely. Firstly, thank you so much, Anthea and Lilia, for having me here today. I think, as Viv touched on, it's a very important conversation to have. Social cohesion and what that looks like, and what role do we all play in strengthening social cohesion. The safety, if you can look at safety in a number of ways, right? But if how we relate to this particular topic is, how do we all, kind of come together and keep each other safe? Australia, Victoria is a very diverse place. You walk around these streets, that doesn't matter what suburb or neighborhood you're in, you see diversity. It's in your face. You're speaking to it. You're eating some food, or you're at a local gathering, etc. So it's, how do we all? Maybe I'd say, would the question be, do we feel safe as a community, or do communities feel safe?
And for some people, that diversity can feel quite threatening, and for others, it's something to rejoice in.
Right.
Of course.
So it's really interesting about how individuals might respond to that.
Growing up, my parents came here in 1990. We started off in Brunswick. There was 17 people in a 4-bedroom house.
Wow.
So it was a very packed up house. Essentially went out to public housing in North Melbourne, right? It's the reason why I mention that is because obviously in North Melbourne, public housing, there's a diversities there. You feel safe because you're with your people.
Mm-hmm.
You're with your community, you're with your neighbours, your friends and your aunties and uncles. So at that moment, in that environment, everyone would feel safe. But it's coming out of that. So when you have to go to work, when you have to go to school, when you have to participate in sports and extracurricular activities, often people, or obviously for myself, that's where I'm a bit uncomfortable. And that's where that safety comes into play.
Yeah, absolutely.
At home, when I'm in this particular environment, I feel like I could be whatever I want. I can say whatever I want, do whatever I want. I feel safe. I feel like I belong here. But at a very young age, doing extra things, going outside of my community, that's where I'm a bit cautious because, is this me? Do I fit here? Do I feel safe here? But I think that just comes back to individuals, communities, people like ourselves, playing that role in ensuring that all people from all walks of life, culture, faith, backgrounds and religions, feel safe in this community. We're all brothers and sisters and all of that.
Absolutely. I am curious about the role of sport because you've been quite active in basketball and various other areas.
Yep.
Does being a part of a team give you an added level of security when you're actually then navigating other groups of people, other areas, other parts of the community?
Yeah, I think it can't be understated the role sports plays in building social cohesion. Working with the North Melbourne Football Club, the Huddle.
Yeah.
Did some amazing work out there, and seeing how they use the power of sport as a tool to engage communities, bring communities together. I found that really powerful, really interesting. Where we're all from different walks of life, but it's the one thing that brings us all together is sports. Kicking a ball, playing basketball, soccer, surfing, doesn't matter what it is. It starts conversations. And I think as a society, as one thing, as Australians too, sport is our second language over here.
Yeah.
Whether it's
in Australia, that's for sure.
Whichever footy team you follow or etc. And I think it adds to that teamwork, that mateship adds to that. And I think sports does play an important role. If I can quickly share an interesting story about sports. My mum, God bless her mum, if you're listening to me, hello, what's happening? But she's a very conservative person, very quiet, very shy. It's 2005. It's the World Cup qualifiers. So the Australian Socceroos are about to qualify to the World Cup. And there was a special moment there when one of the players, I think goes by the name of John Aloisi, scores the winning penalty to secure Australia's position into the World Cup, 2006 World Cup. When that moment happened, mum went absolutely ballistic. Started running around in the streets. All the neighbors came out. But all our neighbors majority of our neighbors were Italian and Macedonian and Greek, and it's just a party. And at that moment, she just felt like, hey, this is me.
She was just part of something.
Yeah.
And she still talks about it till today.
Wow.
So it's moments like that. And we see firsthand how sports can, bring positive energy but connect people together.
Absolutely.
So it's but also playing devil's advocate though. You know, I have to do this. I think there's still more to do. So on the weekend, I went to the Collingwood and Carlton game. Big game, 85,000 people packed in the MCG. For those 4 quarters, we're all together. We're all yelling and screaming and singing and shouting, and we're one big community.
Yeah.
But when the final siren goes, what happens? We each go back to our circles, our groups, our bubbles. How do we preserve that energy? How do we preserve that community feeling?
Well, I was actually going to touch on something similar to that because I found it interesting when you were describing to Anthea what you find safe. You sort of were describing almost establishing safety first within your inner or intimate sort of community, and then being concerned about establishing that sort of safety with the wider Australian community. And it seems as if that's the natural flow for people. They have like this safety net within their immediate community, whether that be their cultural community or just their immediate environment in terms of their area. And then they're concerned about whether or not they can feel comfortable in the wider community. And I think that, it's that question of that transition from, often having to code switch or change your behavior or change your approach to the wider world that might make people feel a little bit unsafe. But I just found that very interesting.
But that's where, to me, representation comes in.
Definitely.
Right? So we see others that are like us, are similar with us or to us. You feel that sense of connectedness, that sense of comfort, that sense of it's okay to be me, and that's, I think, is a part and parcel to me of representation and diversity and visibility and representation in all aspects of our society, which should be. If we look at the diversity of Victoria, of Melbourne, Metro Melbourne, and Victoria as a whole.
Viv,
absolutely.
You've been involved in the dual identity leadership program for the Vietnamese community, which is an incredibly powerful thing because, as we've sort of mentioned, things to do with identity, especially when you've got different heritages and grew up in different places, and all these different elements feed in. Why did you develop that particular dual identity leadership program, and what benefits do you think it's had broadly to the Vietnamese individuals that have gone through it in regard to building social cohesion overall, giving them that sense of safety, that safety of their own person?
For me, when I was thinking about that, I thought a lot about what's the anchor of an individual, and that's got to be about his or her or their identity. Because if we know who we are and we are comfortable with what we've got, warts and all, then we become less inward focusing, but then more externally focusing, and then looking around and say, okay, well, that's what we've got. What can we do? How can we make it better, or how can we improve it? And for a lot of Vietnamese people, and I suppose like many other migrant generations that come before us as well, is that sense of denial about my identity, because we so want to fit in. And that's why my name is Viv and not V, my Vietnamese name. Right? It's something, whatever it is, that we wanted to kind of be part of it, because we I didn't want to bring my Vietnamese spring rolls and fried rice because it's too smelly for everyone else, right? So you brought along sandwiches, which I didn't really like, but I had to kind of eat because I didn't want to be different to the other people. So knowing about me and what my heritage has, and being able to have the knowledge to say, I don't like that bit about my tradition. I do like that part about my heritage. I'll keep that. I won't take that. But have the full knowledge to be able to do that. And that then creates a greater understanding of with the parents as well. And the moment that you've got a reduced level of intergenerational challenges or conflicts, then you have that much greater understanding. And if you've got more harmony in your family, regardless of what we see of the issues, and we could look at mental health, I would place a lot more significance on mental health than, say, my parents would. What's that like? What? I've been in jail for 20 years. What's this health business? Can't you look after yourself? This is nothing compared to back in my days, right? So they say that, but they don't mean anything malicious other than that's their experience. Right. And if we take that approach, then we will have a significant level of conflict. And that's part and parcel of why we thought if we could create that identity, that understanding within the family, then that would have to, by definition, flow on to the outside world.
Wow. And it raises that, for me, it just helped me understand something that I've been thinking about recently, which is, in the youth today, in, say, the African community, Hanad, we've recognized how those who were actually born here are tending to have more problems in terms of with their parents and with the system. And it's hard to understand how that could be the case when, they were born here. But in fact, it's probably, and it could be a lack of, knowing of who they are, or lack of identity issues, essentially, that are causing those issues, because they're not connecting with their family, and there's that generational disconnect. Yep. Is that...
Spot on. Yeah. I think spot on. I think identity plays especially in the youth space, a massive contributor to why young people unfortunately face some of these social issues, whether, as Viv touched on, mental health or alcohol and other drugs, homelessness, youth justice, etc. There's a big piece of work that needs to be done in communities around, like, what is our identity, because we're currently in an awkward position where, where it's that push and pull, where we're here and we're there.
Exactly.
Where's that common ground? As a young man born and raised in Melbourne, I've been here my whole entire life. I faced those challenges. I love my African culture. I love my Somali culture. But hey, I still love my footy, and I'm still Aussie as Aussie can be. But
you're also pulled in not only to do with your ethnicity. You're also pulled in directions based on, as Viv was pointing out, the generational pieces.
That's right.
Definitely.
And especially once you become a parent, then you've got even more dynamics to play out in regard to those sort of different generations. So how do we find? Because I like what you're saying, Viv, about this idea that if the individual can have a degree of comfort, a degree of reassurance about who they are and the fact that they're fine just as they are, then potentially that helps everybody, because they then feel more comfortable about interacting with other parts of society in different ways.
Yep. And starting with the family, because for you, Hanad, for example, you are not quite you at home, because there are some expectations from your parents that are slightly different to, say, the broader societal expectations, and so you never quite fit in. You're not quite Somali at home, but you're not quite Aussie outside, because you have reservations of what other people think of you, or other people might have reservations of what they think of you because they don't know you. So all of these things, I don't quite fit in, I don't quite belong. It can be a real challenge for young people, and for me, I grew up through that, and it's hard. It is very difficult. You're home. When I'm at home for a long time, I felt too Vietnamese. There's certain Vietnamese words I don't understand. There are certain traditions expected of a girl that I'm just too uncomfortable complying. Mm-hmm. And when you're out there, you're a bit shy for your Stocktown standard Aussie person. You should interject. You shouldn't just wait for other people to allow you permission to speak in a conversation. You just got to jump in. Right? And I kept waiting. I never got a chance to speak. So you have to try and balance those aspects, and having some level of comfort and confidence about who I am and what I've got, warts and all, certainly helped me. I don't know about the others. It certainly helped me.
I think I relate to that, as an African Australian, and as someone who's got to a point where I embrace the duality in my identity, and as someone who's taken, the time to understand my culture as well and who I am. I feel as though I don't feel torn personally I don't feel torn in two directions. Am I African? Am I Australian? I'm very much an Ethiopian, but also an Australian. And I think it's because I was able to go through that process of understanding all of those facets of who I am, taking some, maybe rejecting others, but still understanding. It's helped me get to this point. So that makes a lot of sense. I feel as though you've helped me sort of articulate something I've understood intuitively. Yeah,
so then the next step is make others understand that, right?
It's interesting because social cohesion in itself is a process, right? Yeah. The community and society is going through continual change, and so managing and strengthening that social cohesion is an ongoing conscious effort. Yes. But it comes from the individuals, because each individual is going through the same type of experiences of change happening all the time in their lives, and how they manage that is incredibly important as to how they can manage change in society overall. So I think there are some interesting thoughts about what do you think are some of the building blocks for the broader community to think through from a social cohesion perspective? What are some of the things that should be priorities for the society, Viv?
For me, it's a couple of things. It's like making sure that we recognize the barriers and the opportunities, and then making sure that we actually feel or break down those barriers and do so consciously and over time and in a systematic sort of way, and not as an initiative sort of thing where you can say, like you do something and then it really got the attention for the day and then it dies down and then things go back to their business as usual. I think for me that's really important, because then that creates a more equitable and equal platform for everybody to contribute. If it's too difficult, for example, to make everyone go through a development sort of journey, then at least make the environment easier for them to do so, for those that are able to, and to be able to do that. Because I think the systemic barriers are really clear and strong. We don't necessarily want to concede nor acknowledge that. And even when we do, we take a more programmatic approach as opposed to a systematic approach to it all. And by that I mean throwing some money over here, hoping that things will kind of quiet down, but actually the foundations down here are still the same.
It is such a huge challenge though, and I'm sure that you've actually got some thoughts about this, because government and government entities at any level just seem huge, and the idea that a single individual can feel comfortable in being able to make an impact on that. How do I make the health system more inclusive for people like me or like you? How do I actually have an impact on that? It's a really big leap for people to have to think through. So have you got any thoughts about what an individual might be able to do when they're confronting something sort of system-wide like that?
It is hard for an individual, I have to admit. I mean, I can say that now because I'm turning 51. I'm 50 years of age. When I was 20, I wouldn't have that level of confidence or courage to be able to speak up or speak out. And I know I've had plenty of experience where I didn't. And I consciously chose not to because of fear and a whole bunch of other internal matters, right? But I think for the community, and especially for the multicultural community, we do need to come together, and that to me is really important, because we don't want the decision makers to say, well, that's Ethiopian group, then a bit there, and that's a Vietnamese, that's a Chinese, that's a Indian, that's a Greek. We need to come together. What is it that brings us that are common, that allows us to come together? And it's got to be that level of participation, that everybody has an equal opportunity to succeed here in Australia. It doesn't matter whether you've been here 50 years ago or just 5 years ago.
And hopefully our most recent election reinforces that view, that in actual fact every vote, every person matters, and you can make change.
And what about then in the family sort of environment? I'd be interested to know, Hanad, maybe your thoughts about the different ways that either the parents or the children can sort of bridge that gap of understanding.
Yeah, I think it comes back to conversations, having those conversations and being open to listen to the other side. Our parents, God bless them, they've gone through various challenges, coming to a whole new country and setting up shop, and having kids and putting them through the education system and trying your hard every single day, just to create better lives for them, right? They've sacrificed a lot. A lot of the parents, or a lot of the multicultural families still haven't reconnected with their brothers and sisters and siblings, and that whole sense of being left. I'm in a new country, but my whole family's over there, right? So being like not sympathetic but empathetic to their current situation, but also slowly taking them through that journey of understanding, okay, this is how things are now. Working with them slowly. It might not work straight away, but giving them the time they need to kind of understand their current environment. But also, I think we're in a very interesting time at the moment where some of the stuff that Viv was saying is, we need to create a space, an environment where people feel like they're able to participate. That's a big part of social cohesion, to me anyway.
And clearly it's something that you spend some time talking about
Definitely.
is how to make sure that young people feel they have a voice.
Not just young people, but like smaller, my community groups. It's how can we get the voices on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
those grassroots voices, the people who are experiencing these challenges, these issues. How do we amplify their voices so their issues are not only seen, they're heard, valued, and respected? And how can they inform decisions, key decisions that are impacting their communities? As you mentioned, Anthea, this government's so big. Where we're dealing with this monster of a thing, and it's where do you start? Where do you kind of look at this problem? But I think it comes back to the individuals within those sectors, but it also comes back to the individuals in community. It's having the freedom and having the courage to kind of speak up and say, hey, this is wrong.
But Hanad, both you and Viv had a very real experience of this during the pandemic.
Yes.
and during the lockdowns.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit about how both of you were able to actually influence the system in order to ensure that people were actually being treated in the way that they needed at that time?
Oh, of course. I think me and Viv had we had a very, it got to a point, I saw Viv out of the 14 days, probably like 12 out of the 14 days, spent a lot of time with Viv, and big shout out to Vivienne. I think a lot of people still to this day don't know the work she did during those during the hard lockdown in 2020.
But the people on the ground do.
Oh my God, I think she did some amazing work, pulling 13-hour days, standing in the rain, advocating and standing side by side as we are right now, supporting me and opening some doors where I couldn't essentially open. But I think if we come back to that period there during the hard lockdown, we're talking about 3,500 residents, 3,500 community members who've been locked in their homes unwillingly, and placed on a hard lockdown. The interesting thing about that was, what do we know about these communities? That's the gap right there. So when it came time for the recovery, when it came time for the support, the questions are being asked: who are in these buildings? Who are these communities? Where do they come from? What are their dietary requirements? What are the supports that they need? And it was, we started working from the back. When I say we, I mean not me, but I say government, right? Because all of a sudden everyone's looking at each other like, where do we start? How do we support these people? But luckily, the community was able to mobilize at a very, very fast. They were able to mobilize and come together within a day or two, and set up, at the mosque, and set the food up and the communications within the buildings, and talk to various organizations and community groups, and how can we organize ourselves to support our people? Because at that time, honestly speaking, we didn't feel like government understood the severity of the situation. Being from, I used to live in North Melbourne Towers, 32 Alpha Street. I got aunties there, cousins, parents, this, that. I know those buildings. I know all those buildings. And I'm like, this is not going to go down well. But I'm just one person.
But you were one person in a network.
There you go.
And Lydia, I don't know whether you've noticed this. I'm sure you have. But what each of you brought was a bridge. You were a bridge to Hanad was a bridge to Viv was a bridge to the
Government.
Government was then filtered back. What I'm interested in, Viv, is that there was. Do you think there was an underestimation of the ability of community to actually do what needed to be done?
Well, there are two aspects for me. I think the first thing is that our knowledge, or the government's knowledge of the communities, was quite at a very low threshold. That's the first thing. The second thing is there was no trust between the government and the community, and the way in which the government responded to or implemented the lockdown brought the trust level way down to another level. So when you've got no trust and no understanding, it's totally understandable why the community was angry. But I think throughout notwithstanding the lockdown in Flemington and Northman, I think the government totally underestimated the ability of the community to mobilise themselves to support their own communities when there were no policies. The federal policies for international students and non-residents didn't come in for quite some time. The Victorian government's support, the financial support of $1,100, didn't come in until after that. So, but whilst that was all happening, the lockdown happened. People lost jobs. There was no food. They didn't have accommodations to stay. Hand sanitizer, cost of buying all of this stuff weren't there. Who did the work? The communities. They didn't ask government for funding, they just did it. And they did it until the relevant policies came in. And even when the policies came in, the eligibility of those policies was so problematic as well that we, the likes of us, had to say, hang on, you couldn't do that. You couldn't ask them to demonstrate, they've exhausted their annual leave and sick leave and on their pay slip in order to qualify for that $1,100 or $1,500. Some of them didn't even, they get paid on cash. So like, what are they supposed to show? So all of these things, they got modified along the way to make accessibility a lot easier. But that came from like relentless advocacy from many sources. Yeah. And the fortunate thing was that at least they listened. The relevant people in the departments listened. And for the VMC, the way that we did it was that for us, it wasn't about taking sides. It was just about the issues and the empathy of the people who are experiencing those issues to the government, and the empathy that we would have for the public servants who have had no experience in this, having themselves thrown into the deep end and trying to kind of flounder and work out what the heck's going on. So for us, it's that understanding that I felt that we were able to help bring different parties together more than it would have been otherwise.
It's interesting, Lydia, isn't it, that one of the things that we learned, albeit an incredibly traumatic way of learning it, was in actual fact that everybody wanted the same thing. Definitely. Everybody wanted the world to improve. They wanted to be able to go back to work. They wanted to be able to socialise. They wanted their children back in schools. All of those things. They were
united over that
So
shared
if nothing else, from a social cohesion perspective, what we actually learnt was, gee whiz, everybody has the same expectations, the same aspirations.
Exactly.
And such an important thing that we need to continue to remind people about, so that we don't go back into thinking, oh, everybody's different in some way. No, everybody's got the same sort of aspirations. Hanad?
Yeah, it's interesting. So during that time of the hard lockdown, I think it was the second day. Well, actually, the very first day was a Sunday. At the mosque, bright and early, I recorded a video. It's somewhere on Instagram now. It racked up over about 75 or 80,000 hits online on Instagram. Just a call to action, understanding very early on, understanding what was taking place and what was happening. Just a call to action to community. And I made it very clear, like, hey, we all need to come together at the moment. Doesn't matter what area you're from, what the suburb, background, religion. This is a time where we all really need to band together as one and support these vulnerable people in these communities. But what happened after that was we had about hundreds of people from all walks of life in a mosque. The most holy place, for us Muslims, right? All working together, side by side, supporting each other. And I think that's amazing, that's beautiful, but it shouldn't be that only of times of crisis.
Absolutely.
Yes,
that
this
we are
is what
together.
I was thinking about. I was like, it's interesting how, in times of crises, people come together and they unite over that, which is great. But it's also, okay, what happens when we're all relaxed and,
Definitely.
Life is going good? Where do we find those shared values and those shared, visions for our lives in this country together?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As we come to the end of this podcast, I'd be really interested in your views, and you too, Lydia, on the future. What is it that we've learned as a result of the last few years, but also what have you learned through your lives that actually would give us some guidance about where we should go into the future for thinking about creating this more cohesive society? Viv?
If there was one thing I would wish for, I think for me the power and the influence should be a bit more shared and not concentrated to a handful few. For me, I think when we look at these the decisions that are made and the thought process that are considered where to lead to those decisions are too focused on a handful of people or very few people. How about we empower people to be able to have a say, and actually you taking their opinion seriously and giving their opinions due consideration? I think that's really important. And in a practical sense, it comes down to engagement frameworks, having engagement as part of your process in an BAU sort of fashion, not only engage when you need to or you do so as part of some box ticking exercise and so on, and then looping it back, thank goodness, so that you can do what we've provided you with. We know whether you have or haven't or what you've done with our ideas. To me, that's really important. To the decision makers, it feels like it's such a cumbersome process, too time consuming, too costly, but it isn't really. Because the moment we empower the community to know that here are ways that you can channel your feedback to, and then you actually get looped back, then we can move on. If our idea wasn't a good idea because everyone else didn't think it was a good idea, so that all good, move on. But I don't think we have that. It just comes in ebbs and flows. Right now, with the way we are no longer in a pandemic, all of the engagements have just kind of disappeared because of budgetary constraints. Yeah, I get that, but there must be some other ways that some of these things can be maintained.
It is interesting how powerfully the Victorian Multicultural Commission has used Zoom during this time to actually bring communities together, because you made it incredibly easy for hundreds and hundreds of representatives of different communities to come together to learn, albeit something that everybody knew they wanted to know at the time. But it is how to maintain that momentum of people coming together and talking, and as you say, about issues, about those sorts of things that matter to everybly. So
and getting that feedback, and exactly what the Scanlon Foundation is really, exactly what the Scanlon Foundation has as part of their mission, which is to have that feedback through research. And Andrew Marcus spoke about it and the importance of it in the first episode that we did, and you've just echoed it again today, that we need to have that feedback so that we're able to, revise and implement new things. What about yourself, Hanad, to Anthea's earlier question?
Of course, being curious, I'd say. If we're looking at how we can really strengthen social cohesion, curiosity is a big thing. Being curious of your surroundings, of your neighbours, of your colleagues, people you walk by on the street, people you speak with on a daily basis. Conversations are very powerful. Individuals' abilities to storytell, can not only educate but empower individuals. I think social cohesion in Victoria, we've made some amazing progress over the last decade.
Mm-hmm.
There's still some work to be done.
It's continuous.
Definitely.
Never stops.
Definitely. But I think it's having vehicles like the VMC and so many other peak bodies, if you look at FECA and ECCV and so many other organizations where they're doing some amazing work, right? But let's come back down to the fundamentals. Yeah, let's look at it from an individual's perspective, a family's perspective. Often we look too broad, too holistic, and things can get lost, in the messaging. Have those conversations, create environments and spaces where people feel like they belong.
Hanad, what advice would you give to young people who are a little apprehensive about talking about, and they may well be curious, but they don't actually know how to engage in a conversation with somebody that seems considerably different to where they are, or that they think wouldn't appreciate where they're coming from?
Wow, what a question.
I've got some advice while you're thinking. I've got some advice. My advice would be, and this comes from personal experience, and it speaks mainly to that issue of generational disconnect between ourselves and our parents. Give them a chance. Because it actually took situations where I didn't want to give my parents a chance, but I had to, because I was caught out in things, for them for us to be able to confront certain issues. And it was at that point that I was able to understand, like, hang on, Dad was so cool about that. He was so willing to understand it. Actually, in fact, he actually knew, like, he was aware of this, or he, you know what I mean? Or he went through this himself. And I think we, in an effort to not have those confronting or, like, negative sort of situations with our parents, we stay away or we hide things, and we try and do all of that, but it just actually doesn't help. We need to try to get to that point where we actually are willing to talk to them. And it doesn't mean you should be less of yourself, or, kind of be insincere about who you are. I think you should still be assertive about that truth, but then gracefully and gently try and work with your parents.
Just to add to that, I think something that comes to mind when I think about social cohesion, just quickly, is integration. I see it, or social cohesion, is a two-way process. Definitely a two-way process. I think there's responsibility shared on both sides, right? New migrant communities, people of colour, multicultural communities, we have a role to play. So we have to do our part and take those necessary steps to understand our new environment, but also the wider Australian public meet us in the middle. Yeah, if we're really serious about creating strong, thriving, cohesive communities, if we're honestly going to be that glue and that bond, we need to come to a position where we're close. And that involves us taking some steps, and then the broader society taking some steps. And just for young people, I think Lydia, you mentioned it perfectly, right? It's don't be afraid to jump out of your comfort zone. I think sometimes we're too consumed in our own personal environments because we get safety from this. Mm-hmm. I'm in Collins Street in a very tall building, level 31. With an amazing view. But it's amazing. I'm having good conversations. Try new things. Speak to new people, engage with different crowds, and you'd be surprised what you find.
I think that's wonderful advice for everybody. I think both the comments from both of you have been really, really powerful, and the fact that you've shared your own personal stories is even more powerful, because I think that's what people can relate to is, somebody else has had a similar situation to me. So I'd like to thank both of you very much for having been a part of this podcast. It's been just tremendous and has added yet more colour and perspectives to our thinking about social cohesion. So, just incredibly valuable, and thank you very much.
Thank you. This was amazing.
Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute. This podcast is produced by Faisal Farah with sound design and mixing by John Bigelow. Original music is by Official Steno. You can find all our publications on our website at scanloninstitute.org.au. Please subscribe to be the first to receive our next fortnightly edition.